Okay, I'd now like to welcome on a very special guest. We have Joanna Nelson. She is the Director of Science and Conservation Planning at Save the Redwoods League. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Zach. Thanks so much for having me on.
So I don't want to say this is good timing, but it's certainly relevant, you coming on today with the K&P complex fire happening in the Sequoia National Park. And I think you're probably the perfect person to talk about this with. I know this must be a really hard time for you, with what you do and the fire moving in. What's going through your mind right now with that fire as it moves into one of the great forested areas in the world?
As this fire moves into giant forest, just like you've said, this is devastating. This is worrisome, and one little light I see is, for example, in giant forest, there's 40 plus years of prescribed fire and restoration thinning. So land care and land tending works and helps. And also what's going through my mind is this is climate disruption. So the past 6 years before this year, we saw the 4 biggest fires ever in the giant sequoia forest. So there's we have ways that we need to act that are direct land care, restoration thinning, prescribed burning, being able to respond, and then that we have a responsibility to act on climate and get to zero greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, I do want to talk about, the fires that are going on now, because I think it's turned into this bigger discussion, and it's turned political, which is never good in my opinion. With the Sequoia National Park, I saw they were wrapping the bottom of these sequoias. Why is it they just wrap the bottom? Is it because that the most damage comes from the low side of the trunk?
So that's called structure wrap, and that's used in fire defense for buildings, in this case for the trees. One reason they're just wrapping the bottom is that comes from scientific research, for example, from Dr. Nate Stevenson and others, that if you can protect that lower part of the tree, that's going to help the most for the tree not dying from the top, right? That's going to help an active layer of growth cells survive. And also, even though canopy fires can kill trees, there's a lot of heat retained at ground level. So insulating at ground level is a really good place to protect.
I see. That makes sense. So these great trees that we have in Northern California, the sequoias and the redwoods, they are, I think the public perception is that they're somewhat fireproof. How much truth is into that, that tale that they are completely fireproof, and that's why they live so long?
Right. So there's a lot of accuracy in that story, right? It's really important. So both coast redwood and giant sequoia evolved with low to moderate intensity fire. And I'll just repeat that part: low to moderate intensity fire.
Different than we see today.
Different than what we're seeing today.
Yeah.
And so, for example, giant sequoia are fire dependent to reproduce, right? So in terms of defense, they have really thick bark that insulates them from fire damage. Their cones open at high heat, releasing the seeds. And then the seeds germinate well in bare mineral soil. So soil where the duff on the top has been burned away, and there are bare areas. So that's the setup. In order to keep on going as a species, they need fire. And coast redwood, for example, also have really thick insulating bark, respond to fire damage by resprouting from the base. That's something, and they could even resprout from up the trunk. And that's something that giant sequoia can't do. But so I'll return to that low to moderate intensity. Throughout thousands of years, there have been lightning strikes that start natural fires. And there's been thousands and thousands of years of indigenous cultural practice and using fire as a sacred tool to maintain landscapes. So all of that, yeah, that's accurate. Scientifically, culturally, historically, and right now we're getting catastrophic fires, high severity. So our fires are coming faster, burning hotter, burning larger areas, burning further into the soil, further, more of the trees, and that's what they just can't handle. So giant sequoia, instead of enduring for centuries, the large mature trees are dying, the cones are getting burned up, the seeds are getting burned up. That's the mortality.
So, the fire that moved through the Big Basin Redwoods, I guess it's been 2 years now, right?
Just last year.
Oh, it was last year.
Yeah, CZU was last year.
We've had so many fires in the last 3 years. I have trouble keeping up with all of them. So that burned at a higher temperatures, higher heat. So would that fire have accrued more damage than the fires that those redwoods have experienced over the last couple hundred years?
Yes, exactly. And that fire behavior and fire effects can be really patchy. So the Big Basin is a California state park. One state park north, Butano State Park, burned at a much lower severity. And a Save the Redwoods group actually just went hiking there this past Saturday. So one, 15 miles away, it looks really different in terms of severity. And yes, Big Basin burned at a really high severity, and there's a lot of recovery to enact.
So, I guess we can get into this bigger conversation of fire and sort of what's causing it and how we can help. So, you hear all this political talk about, it's, you got to rake the forest or it's climate change, right? And, I've tried to maintain it's a combination of both, right? We have to have great forest management, but also we've set ourselves up pretty poorly with human caused climate change. So, what can we do moving forward to help our forests and to both from a management perspective and from a climate change perspective?
Thank you. I agree with you strongly. It's both. We need to do forest management and we need to take climate action. And in terms of forest management, that looks like doing land care and doing stewardship. Well, what's that? That again is restoration thinning. We have forests that are overgrown with a second growth or sapling stage. We have 100+ years of fire exclusion, fire suppression. And it looks like doing the preparation work for prescribed burning. So before you can light a fire on the ground called broadcast burning, you need to not have the conditions where you're starting a conflagration, right? So you do fuel reduction, you might burn fuel in piles, you might make biochar, you need to get some of those fuels out before you can restore a prescribed fire burning regime. And we need to look to Indigenous cultural practitioners and collaborate well with them without taking what they know. So there's a great podcast called Good Fire. Amy Christensen is First Nations and leads that podcast. And that's a space, and others here in California with the Yurok and the Karuk and the Hupa tribes, and the Amamutsun tribal band, where I hear conversations about really good collaborative partnerships and then real concerns about Indigenous folks bringing forward what they know with dominant culture and having it taken.
Yeah, we hear this all the time, right? The Native Americans did it right because they lived here for thousands of years. And I love Native American history in this area. I mean, Northern California it was like, they think it was the most heavily populated area before white settlers in North America. But we don't have to get so specific on the details, but what is it that they do differently, or that they know that we're just not practicing very well?
So I'm gonna, as usual, be really mindful that I am non-Indigenous and white, so I'm not speaking for any Indigenous practitioners.
Sure.
And I, having had the honor of working with people, I've seen, so I'll bring out names. So Bill Tripp in the Department of Natural Resources in the Karuk tribe has done a lot of speaking with the media. Margot Robbins is the executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council, and I believe she's part of the Yurok tribe. The Amamutsun tribal band is in the south of San Francisco Bay and around the Monterey Bay area. So what I've seen working with tribes is that they are learning, or some use the verb relearning their traditional knowledge, or sharing traditional knowledge that they've had unbroken access to. They're looking at ecological timing of burns, so looking to what tan oak is doing, or particular species of oak for acorn. And so interfacing that with agencies and a different calendar can be challenging, right? You're checking with the California Air Resources Board, you're checking with CAL FIRE for their red flags to be able to notice what's happening ecologically and respond and start a burn, right? So those are things that I've noticed.
I see. Last thing about fire, hopefully, that I wanted to ask is the Castle Fire. Last year, it burned, I think it was 10 to 14% of all, all living sequoias on the planet.
Yes.
What sort of overall impact does that have on our planet? Is that something we just can't know? I mean, we obviously know they have a great, positive impact on our Earth, and so what could we see from that sort of catastrophic loss moving into the future?
Right. So I'll start with that. That is an estimate, and it's a good estimate in a report led by doctors Nate Stevenson and Christy Brigham. And there were contributors from Save the Redwoods League, and people are doing more accurate counts now. So just to say where that number comes from, and then I'll keep going with the bigger question. So there's one place in the world that giant sequoia grow, and it's the Sierra Nevada in California. That's it, right? So and they grow in patches. So depends on who you talk to, but there are 70 plus groves of trees, and losing that losing 10 to 14% of them in 1 year in one fire event is just not sustainable, right? If you play it out, we can't do that 10 times in a row. And we've lost genetic diversity that we're still learning about. What is the genetic character of the trees that we lost compares to the trees that we have. We've lost habitat, we've lost mature trees that have their own place in forest structure. We've just lost these majestic beings. And so that kind of loss is hard to take. And then to have this fire happening again, and just to reiterate, it's not that forest scientists and managers sit around and get startled by every summer fire season. People are working year round to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire. We just get preempted sometimes in our plans with yet another fire.
We're now playing catch up, and we can't keep up with how bad things have gotten, and it's terrible. And I'm not sure how much you know about Active NorCal, but we started off as just an outdoor magazine, and now with everything closed, we report on fires, and it is what it is. So our world has changed, and I think everyone in this area specifically has changed in terms of what we can enjoy, and if the days are smoky or whatever. So it's been it's been sad to see, and it's really hard to deal with, but you know, we got to just keep moving forward.
And I
Okay.
wanted to say, I think it was your September 8th episode, you mentioned that we're either talking about droughts or wildfires when we talk about NorCal. So, yep.
It's true. You know, I grew up, you know, salmon fishing, and now it looks like we're going to have a huge die-off of salmon, you know, and they're all intertwined, right? They're all intertwined with climate change. Yeah. And I've certainly never, you know, I'm young, but I haven't seen anything like this in my life. So, and I don't think we have for centuries, certainly not this human caused climate change. So, okay, I do want to move on to a more positive topic, because I do love the forests of Northern California, and you having such a crucial role in Save the Redwoods League. I'm curious about your story. You know, what brought you into this life of science? Like, were you a science nut when you were a kid, and then you sort of moved from there?
I've always done and been interested in environmental care. Yeah. And as a kid, I had so many interests, and so I was a humanities and science nut in terms of what I studied. But one thing I can point to is both my parents were naturalists. So my late dad and my now mom. And so we'd be out. So I grew up in West Marin and West Sonoma counties, and we'd be out right after a rainy day or in the rain, checking out what comes out in the rain, right? Banana slugs and mushrooms. And so I really appreciate that, instead of when it's classically nice out, right? We get out all the time. And they worked since the inception of Audubon Canyon Ranch. So that's an egret and heron rookery on Bolinas Lagoon in Marin, and now has a fire forward program of prescribed fires. So there's that early instilling it. And then, yeah, just consistently studying environmental science in order to make the best difference. And so I did an interdisciplinary program called Earth Systems at Stanford University for my undergrad and my master's. I worked for 4 years. I decided I was going to do a PhD in science, and that opened the door for me to go to Alaska. So I worked in rural, roadless Alaska on what are the impacts of climate change on wildfire pattern in the boreal forest, and then what does a changing wildfire pattern mean for people who are primarily Native Alaskan in the Koyukon Athabaskan group, who are fishing salmon, who are hunting caribou and moose, who are gathering berries. And so that's, and bringing it back to my home, you know, my knowledge of homelands here in California. So that interest in fire. And then, you know, from this point, after 20 plus years of studying fire, I've been certified as a prescribed fire lighter for 2 years. So that certification is the basic firefighting cert, the wildland firefighter type 2, and involved with the prescribed fire training exchange network and getting to put good fire on the ground.
Awesome. What attracted you to Save the Redwoods League? Because I feel like sometimes the impact of the league flies under the radar, at least for a lot of people up in further Northern California. I think it's more recognized in the Bay Area. But what attracted you to a group with so much history and that does so much for the area?
Yeah, I work in science to action. And that means, for me in my career, what do we need to know in order to do better now in stewardship, right? Roll out what we know now. So it doesn't mean waiting 10 years for a better research answer. You know, when that comes out in 10 years, we'll learn about it. But it means, what's a snapshot of what we know now, and how do we use that to do conservation? And I just really admire that Save the Redwoods League has this go for it mentality of, We will protect and work on restoration for coast redwoods throughout their entire range. So from the south, that's Big Sur in California, all the way up the whole coast to Southern Oregon, and the whole range of giant sequoia. So the ability to track where might these forests move to in the new conditions of climate disruption? What are the threats throughout everywhere that they grow? And so that ability to, again, make a difference in conservation, to work with tribes, to, again, engage with tribes on how do we care for land, and how do we, again, respectfully collaborate and make things better for forests and people. That's something that really drew me.
You really struck me with what you said. With climate change, do we expect the redwoods to move? Do we expect them to creep up? I don't know if it would be north to find a suitable climate in the warming temperatures.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's really interesting, and the broader picture is in the northern hemisphere. Generally, we would expect species to move northward and up in elevation. Right? In the northern end of the coast redwood range, they're doing pretty great, and they're doing pretty great with the changes. The southern end of the coast redwood are a little more stressed on the dry and drought end. So the forests will do different things throughout their range. And then, you know, it's not as cut and dried as everything that I expect to grow together will move lock, stock, and barrel, right? Right. Like,
wow,
I'm going to go for a hike, and there's going to be bay laurel and live oak. And then in the canyons, there's going to be coast redwood, just like there was when I was a kid going hiking, right? So they may disaggregate. And one term for that in ecology is novel ecosystems. We're going to see different combinations of species. Another term in this is assisted migration. Is it up to people to transport organisms, especially that couldn't transport themselves because they're stationary as plants, or because there's a barrier, major freeways for wildlife? And that is a societal value question. Is it up to people to help organisms get to where they could grow better in terms of climate and water availability?
That is so fascinating. I went fishing on the Trinity River last year, and they have all sorts of different, projects to move gravel around for spawning beds. I guess the question is, at what point do we let nature be nature and find its way? And at what point do we help guide it? Because to me, sometimes it feels like we do too much.
So that's another really interesting question of values, and knowing that when we say, let's just let nature, without me making the decisions, right, for our collaborative world, when we say, let's just let nature take its course, except we're raising the temperatures of land and air, and we've brought in invasive species, and we've excluded fire to the point that now we have fuels built up, nature
and built dams, and
it's pretty intense to take those consequences. So in order to say we have intervened, and now and people do intervene in a bunch of ways. We care for land and expect, reciprocally to be cared for. And so in the number of ways we've intervened in the past, we've set up a situation now, and we have goals, and we want to check on how we're doing in terms of those goals. And we do make choices about intervening. And a lot of those are for stewardship, for like, we take care of land. And sure, we have a bunch of different opinions on how to take care of land. You get different management plans or ideas if you're managing for different things, like I'm all about salmon. Well, I'm all about something else. Sometimes those go right together, and sometimes they don't. Yeah.
It's fascinating because, you know, the decisions we make, and we're seeing it, decisions we made 50 years ago, we're seeing the
Yes.
impacts of that, whether they're negative or positive, right?
Yes.
So there's so much at stake with these types of decisions. It just fascinates me. So I would like to talk about the redwoods of Northern California, because I do think a lot of locals don't necessarily appreciate them maybe like they should. You know, I had my family came in from the Midwest, and the first thing they went to see is the redwoods. And you know, that's I don't, a lot of my friends locally wouldn't feel the same way. Why are the redwoods of Northern California and the North Coast so unique? Why are they so old, and why do they grow so tall?
Those are great questions. So I think I have more. I don't know so much of the why, and
Sure.
you know, I can turn it back to you as a comment. We have these trees that are incredibly long lived, right? That we can know with the giant sequoia, right? That 3,000 years ago, here were these trees tended by indigenous people at the same time the Romans were building their architecture, right? Just that where you go to a state park and there's the big giant section with tree rings, and they're labeled back of, you know, here's when this historic event happened, here's when and that tree has seen it all. So just the ability, you know, I don't know what your family said, but to be in the presence of trees that are that tall and that are that old, and what it brings for us in terms of how we respond to beauty, or whether it brings us feelings of peace, you know, or something else entirely of just, whoa, this is so new, I'm still wrapping my head around it. But that's it's really, yeah, an honor to be in the presence of these trees.
Why is Save the Redwoods League, sorry, it's so important for this? Because you know, it's I see all the news coming out of the league, you know, with all the money they're putting in. How important is it for us humans to help these trees survive and thrive in the modern age?
I think it's really important for people to come together and help these trees survive and thrive. And I think, you know, we can respond to some of the challenges, again, that we've brought with habitat fragmentation, with old ways of logging that, you know, with clear cutting, with practices that are really destructive. And there are working forests today that have more of a science basis and a sustainable practice. So we can have working forests and an industry around products and not decimate forests and soil, right? We can protect the species that rely on the redwood forest. So in the coast redwood, the northern spotted owl, marbled murrelets, which are really cool. The one seabird that I can think of that nests in old growth forest on land. Pacific fisher, which is related to weasels and wolverines. You know, so we have an active role in saying, this is how much is in protected land. So public land might be state parks, might be federal lands, might be, again, sovereign nations of indigenous people, or land that's otherwise held in trust for indigenous people. So we can look at where are these forests protected and where are they not, and decide again on that balance of what we're looking for.
I just think it's so important. And I would like to end with the hardest question I probably have for you, because you mentioned the owl, the spotted owl, and it's become controversial because it is protected in areas that we would like to manage. From someone who is a prescribed burner, and for someone who knows so much, how can we juggle the wildlife while also, making areas safe and communities safe from wildfire?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right that it's a tough question. And I think there are so many ways, right? It's easier said than done. And there are so many ways to protect life, right? And to not set it up as this owl or your job, right? Because that's a really artificial setup, right? And that as we need a planet to have jobs, right? It is that, so setting up artificial fights isn't worthwhile. And so having forests with a structure where there are tiny seedlings and young saplings and trees that are in the middle, and then really old trees with a structure that supports denning for these mammals, the fishers, that supports nesting. And then beyond that, the dead trees that again have cavities, have holes in them that make denning habitat. So it's about different life stages for animals. And I know very well that sometimes you have enough water for salmon or you're diverting it to something else, right? It's not like if you just say something holistic, it's going to happen. But it does matter if we choose a frame that's collaborative, and if we choose a frame that says we can have work and admire spotted owls, and we can respect their lives while we respect each other's lives. It happens, so it's possible. Yeah, and I would like to add my own answer to an earlier question. One of the hardest, and we know what to do, which is just, you mentioned it's forest management and it's climate change. Yes, it's forest management and it's climate disruption. And just wanting to say that how we meet climate disruption is collective action, right? Sometimes we get split up into, your individual actions in the place you live. It's collective action. We can work towards international action and national action. And when those fall apart and we're not in charge of them, sure, we go to regional, we go to community level. And I just really love what people have to say. So some of my climate heroes, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who's right now chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, Doctors Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson, who started the All We Can Save project, Mary Anais Hegler and Amy Westervelt, journalists and writers who created the podcast Hot Take. And there's this collective, find your superpower and tap it into climate action, because we need everybody.
Well, I really appreciate the work that you do. And I'm not envious, because you do have to deal with some really difficult topics. It's a difficult time for human beings, because we created this problem, and now we and future generations have to fix it. And it comes with some really difficult questions. And as we're seeing with wildfires, really, it's really hard to deal with. So I really appreciate you coming on. If anyone wants to donate to Save the Redwoods League, I'm having trouble with that today. It's savetheredwoodsleague.org, correct?
savetheredwoods.org, where Save the Redwoods is all one word. Yep.
Yes, and just a fantastic organization. I don't think most people know even a fraction of the amount of work you guys do in the forests in Northern California and the surrounding areas. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thanks for this podcast and getting the word out to people who love Northern California in so many different ways about the environment and water and fire.
Joanna Nelson, thank you so much.